Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to day 6 of 2 weeks of Thomas Hardy, and today I'm going to be talking about my 9th favourite Thomas Hardy book, which is Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Chapter 1. On an evening in the latter part of May, a middle-aged man was walking homeward from Shaston to the village of Marlott in the adjoining vale of Blackmoor, or Blakemore. The pair of legs that carried him were rickety, and there was a bias in his gait which inclined him somewhat to the left of a straight line. He occasionally gave a smart nod, as if in confirmation of some opinion, though he was not thinking of anything in particular. An empty egg basket was slung upon his arm, and the nap of his hat was ruffled, the patch being quite worn away in its brim, where his thumb came in taking it off. So Tess of the D'Urbervilles was first published in 1891, and it is my 9th favourite Thomas Hardy book. And I feel like people will probably be fairly surprised to find Tess of the D'Urbervilles so low down my list. I should say that from today onwards, I love all of the books that I'll be talking about an awful lot. I've now got out of the way the 5 Thomas Hardy novels, which while I like, I don't really love, and I feel are kind of been a bit deservedly forgotten. Not that they're not good books, but they're just nowhere near as good as the rest. And now from today onwards, I'm going to be talking about Hardy novels that I think are brilliant and I think are absolutely worth reading and I think are wonderful, incredible books. From today onwards, I think all of these books are brilliant, and I do think Tess of the D'Urbervilles is a brilliant, brilliant book. And it's less of the stuff that I don't like about this book and more that there are other Hardy novels that I just love a whole lot more. So I will be quite surprised if you have managed to not know at all what Tess of the D'Urbervilles is about, but basically it's about a young woman called Tess Durbeyfield. She is from a fairly poor and ordinary background. Her family are farmers, but one day someone tells her father that he's managed to trace their family back to the ancient line of the D'Urbervilles, a very wealthy aristocratic family, some relations of whom live nearby, and Tess's family have this great idea that they should send Tess as the young woman of the family to go and meet their very distant aristocratic relations so that she could try and get some financial support for them. But when Tess finds herself mixed up with her aristocratic cousin, Alec d'Urberville, who is probably not her cousin and is really quite morally dubious, everything kind of goes wrong. I don't feel that it's much of a spoiler to say this because Tess of the D'Urbervilles is very widely spoken about, and I feel like it's impossible for me to explain what this book is about without saying this. But basically Alec d'Urberville pressures Tess into a sexual relationship. Not exactly clear from the way that Hardy writes this, being a Victorian writer and not going into great detail whether or not this is rape, but whether Alec d'Urberville technically forces Tess or not, he definitely pressures her and deceives her into a sexual relationship with him. The book follows Tess and the rest of her life and the effect that what happens with Alec has on her and the effect of her reputation on the way that people perceive her. There are many things about Tess of the D'Urbervilles that I think are brilliant. I think it's an incredibly important and powerful book. I think the way that Hardy explores Victorian ideas of sex and sexuality and Victorian ideas of relationships and respectability and reputation, the way that Hardy looks at how Victorian society has these double standards for men and women and the way it considers so-called fallen women are brilliant and is fantastic, and it makes this book absolutely worth a read, especially if you're interested in Victorian gender, but just in general, to be honest. Aside from the Victorians, I still think that Tess of the D'Urbervilles is incredibly important as a book today in terms of looking at issues of rape and of consent. But what happens in Tess of the D'Urbervilles is Alex says to Tess, "May I treat you like a lover?" And she is very young and she has no idea what he means. It is impossible for Tess to consent to something which she doesn't understand. And in terms of modern 21st century issues of rape culture and issues of consent, that stuff is all so relevant and makes this book a very, very important book. And beyond that, there is so much else in Tess of the D'Urbervilles that I think is fantastic. I think Tess is a very interesting character, and I think Hardy's emphasis on the fact that despite what's happened, despite the fact that Victorian society views her as fallen, he still calls her a pure woman. The full title of the book is Tess of the D'Urbervilles, A Pure Woman, and there is this great emphasis on ideas of reputation and purity and on the position of women within Victorian society, which I think is done brilliantly. I think the way that Hardy looks at issues of double standards is very, very interesting as well. And along with all of that, there are so many other interesting issues in this book. Issues of farming, issues of the effects that technology has on this rural landscape, issues of morality and religion and love. There are so many important things in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and I think it is absolutely worth a read. I would definitely recommend it. But the reason why Tess of the D'Urbervilles is not higher up in my Hardy hierarchy is partly because it's one of those books that I respect more than I like, and I think is important more than I enjoy. I don't enjoy it as much as other Hardy novels. I'm not as gripped by it as other Hardy novels, but while I think it is an incredibly brilliant book, while I think it is better than some of the other Hardy novels I'm going to be talking about in the next few days, I don't like it as much, and I just can't like it as much. I think this is partly just because it is a very difficult book to read in terms of the subject matter. I think it's also partly because I find no hope in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Like, Hardy writes a lot of bleak books, a lot of miserable, awful books, but most of them, there's like at least like one scene of happiness, and Tess I find so relentlessly awful. And this is going to sound ridiculous, especially when a week on Sunday I talk about what my most favourite Hardy novel is, because my favourite Hardy novel is in a way bleaker and more depressing than Tess, but my favourite Hardy novel, which I'll talk about later, there are at least moments of happiness in this, and I don't find them in Tess. And I know that some people do, and I think part of the reason why I don't find them is just because I really hate Angel Clare. Angel is a man that Tess meets and falls in love with later on in life after everything that's happened with Alec, and I really despise Angel Clare. And I think you are meant to. Like, the name Angel is ironic, and the way that Hardy explores double standards and issues of morality through Angel is very, very, very interesting. He's not meant to be an entirely likeable character, but my complete dislike of the character of Angel Clare and of his hypocrisy does stop me enjoying the book. I also feel that I read Tess the D'Urbervilles too young. I have read it twice. I first read it when I was about 14 years old, and then I reread it and studied it while I was at university. And while I got much more out of it the second time, I don't think anything can erase the fact that I just didn't really like it when I was 14. It was the first Thomas Hardy novel I read, and I was too young. I don't think that that would be the case for every 14-year-old, and I definitely don't think it would be true to say that 14 is too young for any Hardy novels, but I do think that there are certain books of his, especially Tess the D'Urbervilles and Jude the Obscure, that you should read when you're a bit older. For example, I know that I saw the film of Jude the Obscure when I was about 14 and hated it. I thought it was awful. And then I read it when I was about 16 or 17 and I had a much greater appreciation for it. And I wish that I had read Tess the D'Urbervilles first when I was 16 or 17, and I think I would have loved it more, because I do think that 14 was just a bit too young for me to read Tess the D'Urbervilles, for me to fully understand it and appreciate its worth. And so even though I have reread it since then and liked it much more, I can't really ever escape that first feeling that I just didn't get that much out of it. I think especially because at the age of 14 I was just getting into Victorian literature and I was reading masses of Victorian literature. I was discovering so many new authors, and for my first Hardy novel to be a novel that I found really disappointing and didn't really like, that did kind of affect my beginnings with Hardy. And I think it was another year or two after that before I read any Hardy, which was probably a good thing because it meant I was older when I read more Hardy, but I do think I was just a bit too young for Tess the first time I read it, and that did kind of affect my view on it. So I do think that the reasons why Tess the D'Urbervilles is not higher up on this list are in general very, very personal ones to me. They're reasons why I don't love it as much as other Hardy novels, rather than reasons why you won't, because I do think it is one of his best novels, even though it cannot be one of my favourites. Regardless of my own personal complicated feelings towards it, I do think that it's a very, very brilliant novel, and I would urge everybody to read it. So that is basically all I have to say about Tess the D'Urbervilles. Please let me know down in the comments if you have read Tess the D'Urbervilles and what you thought of it. I'm especially interested to hear from you if Tess the D'Urbervilles is your favourite Thomas Hardy novel, because I do understand for a lot of people why it is their favourite, and like I said, I think it's one of his best, even if I can't love it that much. Like, objectively, Tess the D'Urbervilles is a better book than my favourite Thomas Hardy novel. Objectively. Subjectively, I love 8 Hardy novels more than it. But anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I'll be back tomorrow talking about another Hardy book.